Well, it should all be working now. Hello, hello. Okay, so I'm seeing connection on my side. Hopefully that means it's all working. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. Sorry, I'm saying that. I was hesitating for a second because I see these posters going by, and I was like, is it the full title of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania? It is. Um, but we're off to a real bumpy start, anyways. So, uh, well, but I guess that's appropriate for this movie. Even on these posters, as I was setting up the stream, I was like, oh wow, this is like a month after the movie came out. So I really took my time with this one, not only in making this review relative to when I had seen it, but also like watching it in the first place. So I watched it earlier this week, and then took until now to get around to actually streaming it. But I am glad we kind of doing a morning stream, so hopefully I can catch some viewers who don't live in my time zone exactly. It might be tuning in for this, although based on what I've seen in chat so far, it might be more in between that. I'm gonna actually refresh that because I have a feeling this is all jammed up, but whatever. YouTube will catch up in its own time. It does appear to be working on my end, so I'm just going to keep going, and either way, if this is just what people are going to see if they're rewatching it later, that's fine too. So yeah, I watched this movie, and I had already heard pretty middling things, to say the least, and really didn't care for it myself watching it. Tevi Smoka, hey, how's it going? It's always good to see a little bit in chat just to confirm that people can hear me and stuff. But yeah, so that all happened. Tevi's asking how my day's going. Good so far. It's relatively early for me, and so this is pretty much the first thing I'm doing today. But well, aside from just setting up and everything, and so far I'm feeling good. I'm in a pretty good place these days. It's been an interesting week and a half, but yeah. So I watched Quantumania. Unlike something such as Wakanda Forever, which me and my partner were pretty quick to watch, like day one of it coming out, and so forth. Tevi saying I thought the movie was fun, and I will say something about that in a minute, but yeah, neither of us were super motivated to see this. I think Sabrina, my girlfriend, was trying to wait out this movie, like hoping for it to show up on Disney Plus before we actually got around to seeing it in theaters. And we were pretty busy in that first chunk of February, or I guess that second half of February that the movie was out. So we just didn't get around to seeing it until now, in like basically an empty theater. But yeah, we both had a pretty miserable time, and I'll talk a bit about why that is and why I found it to be a difficult film. And I guess I'm leaning more towards critics, although I've noticed on something like Rotten Tomatoes, it's not like the audience score is much better, so I know I'm not alone on this. But I will say, like right before this stream, I just was checking out some threads on Reddit, and they were mostly just comments talking about what they liked about the film, and that was honestly the best thing I could have read before going into this stream, because it kind of put me in a mindset already of like, okay, well, some people liked it, there's things about this movie people liked, and I'm not necessarily here to trash it all, but I definitely lean to this, like, to feeling like this is a lot more similar in tone and my reaction to something like Thor Love and Thunder over Wakanda Forever or The Loki Show, which is particularly relevant given the villain of this movie. And there's a pretty clear division in my brain with the MCU so far in Phase 4, and this is technically the first movie of Phase 5, but it fits this pattern of, unlike the first three phases of the MCU, which were pretty consistent in quality, they definitely struggled a lot more in their first two phases, and I think that might be relevant to this conversation even because we are kind of resetting for phase 4 and 5, and maybe it is just that trend of them having to build up again, and these earlier movies kind of falling into certain patterns like the earlier movies of the MCU did, until they really finesse it going into phase 3, which in this version would be phase 6. But I find that with every MCU product these days, you get like something really strong and interesting, such as WandaVision, the Spider-Man movie, the most recent one, obviously, but then like Far From Home is kind of awful, but I really like No Way Home. I enjoyed Multiverse of Madness, but I understand a lot of people didn't. Thor, a lot more people kind of inconsistent on it. Eternals, same thing. Most people enjoyed Wakanda Forever and Loki, and then most people, I think, definitely had some issues with stuff like She-Hulk. So I find it's almost like a coin flip at this point as to whether or not I'm going to walk out of an MCU movie enjoying it or a TV show enjoying it. And that's a pretty rough place to be. So there's parts that I really like about the movie, but there's a lot of parts I struggled with. And I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of that, but I do want to catch up and chat, which is kind of going and going and going with me rambling on, ignoring it. But it's good to see viewers kind of coming in and stuff. So I do think that's a nice way to couch this at the start, at least. I had a lot of problems with this movie. I had a lot of problems like sitting through this movie. I have a lot of very specific qualms with aspects of this production that I want to talk about. But let's see what chat was saying. Because Tevi was saying that he thought this movie was fun. Plus, Kang the Conqueror is really awesome. Tevi wrote a bunch of stuff in chat, so I'm just going to go right through it. He does understand the criticisms with this movie, but the criticism with Modoc made no sense to me because it's Modoc. What did people expect? Well, let's pause there because I hated Modoc. I thought... So, I have a friend who's been always saying to me, like, oh, the MCU, like, really needs to have, like, real Modoc. Like, Modoc as we see him in the comics with the little stubby arms and legs and all that stuff, and as he exists. And when he was first introduced, I got excited because that's what I thought he was. He had all his crazy weapons. He was violently attacking the group of quantum refugees that we had met, including... what's his name? The telepathic guy, Quarks or something like that. Quacks. And so there was this energy to it that I was like, oh, okay. Like, it's Modoc. That sounds pretty good. But then we tied it to Corey Stoll, and I feel like by the end of the movie we had compromised away on anything that had made Modoc fun. No aim. So that side of him's gone. And even the idea of him being like this recurring... hilarious / awesome dangerous villain that can be so many things all kind of compressed into this movie in a way that I didn't find fun or interesting or well done. I thought he was a particularly terrible adaptation. And by the way, I love Corey Stoll. I loved him in the first Ant-Man movie. I think he was great in The Strain, which is a TV show he starred in. He was also in House of Cards and played a pretty memorable role in that. So, I don't have a problem with that actor, but, oh boy, between the effects and the acting, and the written dialogue for him, all of it was just a miss for me. And I don't want to get too down on this movie. I know there are people out there who like it, and, you know, you're perfectly entitled to. I mentioned Multiverse of Madness, and I liked that movie when I first saw it. I said as much on my review for that, or whatever form of review I did for that. And I know there are people out there who aren't fans, and I've spent a long time since then hearing people say, like, oh, I didn't like this and that, and found Multiverse of Madness was a mess, and so on. So I understand it. Like these things are subjective and stuff, but I'm going to share my thoughts, and a lot of them aren't positive. Some of them are, and I will get into them as I go along. But I have a lot of issues with this movie, and I'm glad that we're getting Modoc out of the way because, yeah. Nick Wilson, thanks for joining us. Nick Wilson's been like a member sometimes of our channel, so it's always great to see you, and I always appreciate that. Tevye is saying, also a huge fan of Cassie Lang Egg's stature. I was so happy to see her finally suit up and kick ass. Okay, so then we'll move on to another thing that I've been kind of ready to talk about. Like I have a lot of these points. I have notes on my other monitor over here that I haven't had to refer to much yet, but they are there to help me out. But okay, so let's talk about stature because I have a lot of thoughts on that too. And so here's the thing: we've seen Cassie Lang since the very first Ant-Man movie, I believe. Yes. So she's played by Abby Ryder Fortson in the first two films. Is basically just a little girl. I actually liked her. I thought she was cute and fun, but I get particularly there why there would need to be a recast, especially in Avengers Endgame, where she would be played by Emma Furman, who I need to see because I remember the part. Oh yeah, her. But I think she's also a little young for what they wanted in Quantumania. So they recast her again with Catherine Newton. Now, Catherine Newton, like Corey Stoll, I know, and I like. She played Castiel's daughter in Supernatural, for those of you who have seen that bonkers show. But she did a really good job in that, and she was amazing in that movie with Vince Vaughn, where she plays, well, okay, I don't want to give that away, but she plays a teenager in that. And I need to find that movie. I have it somewhere buried in here. Freaky. She plays Millie in Freaky, and yeah, I don't want to give away spoilers for that movie. I feel like spoilers, especially for this, like for Quantumania, which has been out for a month, is pretty fair game at this point. And while Freaky's been out much longer than that, the less you know about that movie going in, the better time I think you'll have. And Newton is so powerful of an actor in that film that I know she can act, but I don't think she's good for this part. Because in both Freaky and Supernatural, she plays like two very different roles, and they fill a pretty broad spectrum of different types of characters she could play. But I think she's very good at having someone with like a heavy attitude. In Supernatural, she's like a broken kid that's like all grungy, and in Freaky, like she's not grungy, but the idea is she's been through a lot. So she's like a troubled kid who's got a lot of attitude and talks back against the protagonist and her father. And so it's a whole thing. And then in Freaky, she, like, I don't want to talk about that too much because I'll give away the game. And that's a good movie. I would recommend it. Like, it's fun, and I don't want to spoil too much. But she really takes that version of the character even farther. So she can really play, I guess we'll say, an anti-hero. She can fill in a lot of those girl boss tropes, I guess. And I say that reluctantly because that can be done disastrously. But if you want a character with attitude that doesn't feel obnoxious, I feel like Catherine Newton can pull that off. But this version of the character, Cassie Lang is much more of, I guess we'll say, a generic protagonist, but also even as she's depicted in the comics, she's more beholden to Scott Lang having died by the time that she's introduced as a superhero, and that determines a lot of her character. She's more peer focused because she's on a team of Young Avengers, and the character, I guess, is a bit more noble. And in my mind, like, Newton just doesn't quite feel like the right fit for me. I don't know who it would be exactly, but I feel like there are a lot of actors out there who would be perfect for that role, and I'm not sure it was Newton. And I love Stature, the comic book character, so it was kind of really rough seeing that and seeing a character whose delivery on a lot of these lines felt really flat. And part of it has to do with the dialogue. And I already mentioned how I felt the dialogue was pretty awful for Modoc. It's pretty awful for every character. And I have this moment stuck in my brain. where Scott wakes up and he's surrounded by all these weird quantum aliens, or what, quantum beings we'll call them, or whatever, and they're like all chanting, and Catherine Newton just says, "Dad, you have to drink the ooze," and she says it so awkwardly, and then the scene just ends on a close-up of Scott's face looking confused or something like that. It's very, very strange in terms of just as an editing choice, as director choice, and also even just the delivery of that line sucked. It's kind of supposed to be funny moment where it's like, oh, like look at all this crazy stuff that's happening on this alien world. Reminds me a lot of the tone that they took in Thor Ragnarok, but it just doesn't work as well here. It's not as competently executed, and part of that is because it plays like a weird watered down version of a Rick and Morty episode, which makes a lot of sense because the writer is what's his face, Jeff Loveness, who's a Rick and Morty writer. He wrote the Vat of Acid episode, so he's a good comedy writer, but I feel like he either needs someone like Dan Harmon to kind of give his writing a little more of an edge, which I definitely feel like was a problem with this movie because it completely lacked an edge, or Marvel and Kevin Feige and Disney took all the edge out of his writing and this just became a boring nothing movie. It was so disappointing. I will say there's one part, you know, I've just like pretty slammed this movie pretty hard, and I tried to warn you guys it was going to happen, but there was one part I really liked where the ants ended up living thousands of years of existence and forming this sophisticated technocracy. They even outright say, I loved that line. And they, to the point that they can basically handle Kang no problem. That was great. It was a really nice payoff to an otherwise pretty boring third act, in my opinion. I was completely bored with that battle until the ants showed up, and then I was having fun again. And it was nice seeing that, like, Kang being overthrown. He made a pretty good villain. I can see how or why Marvel wants to go in that direction, but it does feel like... Okay, so we'll hold off on that, because I do have thoughts about where they're going with Kang going forward, but in terms of his role in the villain, here, he was pretty sinister. It's all the dialogue around him that was just terrible, and even a lot of his dialogue was pretty bad. I hated how Michelle Pfeiffer's character, like Janet Van Dyne, she did this thing, and it's, you know, I've seen it in plenty of movies and TV shows before, but it's like, and you know, it's implied based on the very rushed beginning of this movie that they've all been living on Earth, kind of recovering from all the events of Endgame and stuff, for a while now. And the original Wasp, like, we'll just say Michelle Pfeiffer, won't talk about what happened to her. And she's like, oh, it's just so traumatic. Oh, I can't talk about it. Oh, this and that, and so on and so forth. She does it like a few times, and it just takes forever for us to get around to what happened in the microverse or the quantum realm, whatever they're calling it, that we like couldn't share with anyone, couldn't warn people about this very relevant villain to what happened in the Loki series that she encountered before, apparently, which doesn't really fit with the Loki plot, but whatever. It kind of works. It's just, I guess it does work because of the nature of the quantum realm. Okay, so that part was thought through, and I liked the post-credits bump with Loki to a degree. Like, it was fun seeing him and Owen Wilson again. It's interesting that they seem to know what's going on to a degree, or at least Loki is explaining it to Owen Wilson, like Mobius or whatever his character's name is, and he's listening. So whatever they got planned with Loki, that was pretty fun. That stuff all kind of worked for me, but it feels like this movie relied a lot on cliches, tired jokes that did not make not like my girlfriend nor me laugh, and all these other things. All right, I'll read more comments. I'm sorry, I've been talking over a lot of it, but had a lot of thoughts about this movie, and I was originally reluctant to stream because I was like, oh, what am I going to say? What am I going to talk about that like probably hasn't been said by a bunch of other critics? I haven't looked into a lot of other reviews. I've kind of gotten the gist of it from other titles and thumbnails and little excerpts here and there, but I haven't really sat down and listened or read too much else. But I do get the sense from a lot of my critic peers out there that they also kind of thought down of this movie. But I expect that I am going to stumble onto my own views and my own criticisms and stuff. So, I'm feeling comfortable about it. Clearly, I have a lot to say about this movie. We'll see if we end up with one of those streams where it ends up being like an almost runtime length of the movie itself in the review, because we did do that last time. But we'll go and we'll see we'll see how this happens. Tev is saying, yeah, he enjoyed No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness too. Nick Wilson was saying, thanks for posting, Arden. Compared to your grading videos, Ant-Man 3 wasn't good. Oh, well, that's nice. Thanks. I'm sitting on a video right now, but it's got some weird rights issue with the music that I'm sorting out with the company that owns the rights, and I have permission to use their music. It's just in a weird limbo right now, and so their bot won't let go. But eventually there is a video to come out, so that'll be pretty cool. It's not grading, but I was working on that recently too, and that we're going into the 90s with Teen Titans, so that will be exciting. And then people in chat are saying nice things to each other, which I won't bother to repeat here, but that's cool. I always appreciate that. Oh, I see what I can do there. Okay. YouTube has a couple of new chat features I was just checking out. Nick is saying Kang was awesome. It was cool because I finished the new Kang and Doctor Doom comic a week before it came out, so I was hyped as hell to see it, the Kang Dynasty comic. That's something that is cool, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's always an interesting trend where Marvel and DC will shift towards characters they know are coming out in film, but I would argue it's a good example of marketing, and it reminds me of the now defunct Square Avengers game, or Crystal Dynamics Avengers game, whatever you want to call it, that basically, like, I guess we'll say botched that time and time again, and very rarely would be able to have releases that at all matched what was coming out in the MCU and stuff. Are there bots in chat? Because I don't see any bots. I'll keep an eye out for that, though. Shadowcatcher was saying the movie could have done without Modoc. I guess so. There's a lot of ways you can include Modoc, and even introducing him through this Quantumania stuff wasn't a bad idea, because he's weird enough that it makes sense it would exist in this weird, like, microscopic universe. So I think that part's fine. Where my problem is how he was executed, which was just, like I said, just a bit of a miss on all counts, in my opinion. And, if you like how Modoc was depicted, that's perfectly fine. This movie made me feel like it was a lot closer to the kind of compromises we had to accept for comic book movies before the MCU, where they would take characters like in the Fox X-Men movies and really kind of like butcher them or misuse their, what am I trying to say, like their original image, or just for their own pet projects. So taking one of the movie characters from before and giving him the identity of an existing villain feels like one of those old moves to me that the MCU in its earlier days largely avoided, and showed a certain respect towards the comics they were trying to adapt, but also a certain love for the stories they were trying to adapt, where they're trying to bring out the things that they love about these stories to film, that I think really worked. And I didn't get that feeling from this movie. I kept trying to think of that when I was watching it, of like, well, like what are we trying to evoke here, or what about like Marvel Comics had this writer and director excited about things such that they wanted to make this, and I struggled with that. It felt more like they were making a Rick and Morty movie to me, and that was really disappointing. I think a good example of that is how rushed, like I said earlier, the beginning was, and how little time we spent in terms of setting up, like, Cassie Lang, who they really should have invested time in because she is a new actor playing this character, no matter what at this point. And also, like, what's going on between our characters before going into the quantum realm. And that also reminds me of the other supposed protagonist of this movie, which is absolutely worth talking about, but Wasp is barely a factor in this movie. She has a cool part to play with the weird probability matrix where there's like a bajillion Wasp and Ant-Man clones running around at some point. That was a pretty cool effect. I might be lagging out. Let me check something here. I had connection issues earlier, like yesterday, I guess now, but okay. Hopefully, the internet doesn't slow down on you guys, or I start lagging out. I'll have to keep an eye out for that, because that has been a problem before. Let me see what OBS is saying. Yeah, okay. It might just be a blip on YouTube's side, because I'm like uploading a pretty decent amount by the looks of it. Okay, so, damn it, I hate when that happens. I got interrupted. Tevi was saying that not chat bots, he was talking about the YouTube copyright bots. It's actually not YouTube's fault in this case. It's this music company we work with called Epidemic Sound that just we're switching over accounts, and so it's in a weird limbo right now, and it won't let us safe list our thing. Okay, so the connection thing went like away, so hopefully I won't lag out too much. But yeah, so as I was saying, Wasp really felt wasted as a character. Like, she didn't do a lot. It's supposed to be a movie about her, but she barely felt anything there. And I just found that so frustrating. It's called Ant-Man and the Wasp, and in the first Ant-Man and Wasp movie, which was like technically Ant-Man's second movie, I feel like they really did a good job making time for Evangeline Lilly's character and making Wasp really present there. Now, I will say, I was doing a little bit of research before this stream, and I did learn, and it does make sense, that a lot, like this movie in particular, was affected by COVID. It's not the only MCU project to have been affected in that way, but that made a lot of sense to me, why some actors were and weren't present. Judy Greer and her, husband in this film, like that character, neither of them show up. We don't really see like Luis Guzman and that gang, or whatever. No, it's not Luis Guzman, sorry, but I'm screwing it up. But we don't see like Scott's buddies from the first two films, and I thought that was really surprising. So I think that could explain a lot, and I don't know if it excuses it, because you could always just have waited and taken a little longer to film, and a lot of the issues aren't so much about where the characters are or what characters were involved in certain scenes, but the writing and how these characters were written and what the dialogue was like. I talked about Jeff Loveness, and he's an interesting writer. I feel like he really needs someone else to have refined his script a little bit, like a co-writer to help finesse some of those ideas, or even someone other than Peyton Reed as director could have also steered this ship a little bit in a way that made this movie hit a little more home for me. It just needed like a little bit of finesse to it, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with the idea that COVID is the cause of that. Like, that feels like more of a writing issue, and it's the same issue that Thor had, and maybe Thor is also a COVID-related movie. We'll see. Maybe now that we're really out of a lot of these COVID limitations, if the movies, especially on the MCU side of things, start to really steer towards a better direction. But we'll see, because I also don't know how many of these MCU produced things were created during COVID. There's probably a bit of a lag to all of that, just with how production goes and stuff. So I'm curious about all that. I was also thinking about the movie, like while we're watching this. And we saw the preview for Guardians of the Galaxy 3 before this movie, and that looked pretty good. And I'm curious how that goes. I enjoyed the holiday special, and it was nice to see all those characters again with James Gunn directing. It felt meaningful, even though the holiday special was just a short and fun little thing. It worked for me, and I enjoyed it, especially with Cosmo. So that was great. And I'm pretty hopeful for Guardians 3. But I was thinking about, okay, so Guardians 3 is going to come out, and then James Gunn is basically leaving the MCU to go basically take over, at least in a similar creative vein to like what Kevin Feige seems to be doing, the DC movies. And as I'm thinking about this, watching Quantumania and not really enjoying it, and also having enjoyed Black Adam quite a bit, and the last Batman movie that came out last year, which was pretty good. So I'm thinking about all this, and I'm wondering, like, is it possible that we're going to go to a phase where suddenly the DC movies are what's interesting and we're talking about and what gets fans excited and starts to really bring an audience to theaters, while Marvel is going to go to the wayside and struggle a little bit like DC was over the last decade? And are they going to like fall in and out of sway with each other like that? And I'm very curious to see if that happens. It's also a refreshing reminder of the value of competition in these sort of things, because I think sooner or later Marvel was going to face this like creative lull. They weren't going to be able to maintain the momentum leading up to Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. I don't know if anyone expected them to, but at some point, like, Feige was going to either leave or whatever, like, magic formula they had managed to craft with the first 3 phases of the MCU, it wasn't going to last forever. And I always knew that. But the good news is, if DC starts to do a really good job, then it will kind of force Marvel to make changes and to push out better content and figure this stuff out a little bit, which has me excited. We could very well reach a day, and it almost reminds me of like the history of them in the comics, where they both start to release stuff where not everything's going to be golden, but they both put out gems, and there will be stuff worth talking about year to year, and that to me would be exciting. Now, okay, so where am I? Okay, so I think I've like lost my place in chat a little bit, so I'm just gonna kind of go along with it. Tevi's saying Modoc's always been a joke character. You can't take him seriously. I agree and disagree. I think he can be sinister in the right context, or at least, like, I don't know if he's just been a joke character or if he's been a fun character that can be a goofy villain but also have a bunch of deadly weapons and be a potential threat. In my opinion, like, I guess this is one thing where maybe I'm being like an old hat in terms of this, but I feel like in the comics they, especially in the older comics, they really achieved that balance better, when Modoc comes across as threatening while also goofy. Kind of like, is it Mojo, I think, from the X-Men comics, is like a goofy villain, but goofy villains should still have a degree of intimidation to them, in my opinion, especially in something like this. Something like Rick and Morty, you can have villains that really just aren't threatening at all, but I do think that is merited in something like this to dig a little deeper than that, if that makes sense. Nick Wilson saying the 9 months he was a member, I took a hiatus. I mean, I did put out content as best I could in between that time, but yeah, there's definitely been severe content lulls that I haven't really been able to break. It is something I'm working on and working towards. There have been changes going on behind the scenes that can hopefully justify a little bit stuff. going forward. But yeah. Okay, so Tevia asked a question I've already kind of answered just in my ramblings now. Tevia is saying Michelle Pfeiffer's character was technically trapped for a little decade, and I don't blame her for not talking about her experience in the quantum realm. I agree up until a certain point. When the beacon starts being activated and you're being pulled in, and yeah, she is freaking out, but when it's scene upon scene of that, it's tiring for us, the audience, and at a certain point, she just has to be honest or something, because she's putting her family in very active danger by not doing it, and it was frustrating to me. I don't think I'm wrong in pointing that out, especially just because it's trope heavy. And yes, it makes sense from that, like a writing perspective, to do that, or like I guess from like a technical perspective, but from like a Doylean perspective, it puts us in the audience in a rough position, and they never had to do that. They're not obligated as writers to do that for some reason, to keep us in an unnecessary amount of suspense, because there's no reason why Michelle Pfeiffer's character had to have met Kang before. That didn't add anything to the movie. So that's my problem with it. Like, you can argue like the technicalities of that, and it's perfectly fine to do so. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. Like, it was unnecessary to put us in these places where Michelle Pfeiffer had to have these specific traumatic experiences, in a way that like made it so prohibitive to us finding any information out as the audience until like a third of the way into the movie. So I hope I'm articulating what I like had a problem with there. They did it to unnecessarily gatekeep suspense when we didn't really have to. There's a lot of ways you could have done this, where Michelle could have talked about how she had this complicated life that she wasn't talking about too much. Well, I don't know. There's a way to structure your movie better, and they didn't achieve that. And I think maybe that's just me being a little nitpicky, but I do think that's a pretty core problem with the movie, is that we're constantly being held back from finding out the information until they're ready to do like the flashbacks and ready to explain like what Kang's looking for and so on and so forth. And I don't think that added anything to the movie. Oh, I got another good example of it. It's that telepath guy we keep seeing come back on, and he's from like The Good Place, and another good actor who's kind of wasted. So he's reading the mind of Scott and Cassie, and he's like, no, they don't know anything about anything. Literally 2 minutes later, they name drop Janet, and they're like, oh, you know Janet? We know Janet. The fact that you revealed Janet's name is very important to us. So why didn't the telepath care that they have this huge relationship with Janet, who's supposedly this important character? He's a telepath. He should know that's important to the other lady. So stuff like that, to me, strikes me as a script that hasn't been drafted out enough, that hasn't been looked over, that they haven't thought about silly little things like that, but things that are vitally important for your movie to make sense and for your dialogue not to feel like it doesn't respect its audience, painful, cliched. There was a lot of stuff going through my head when I was hearing all this dialogue and such. Tevye was saying, oh yeah, the Avengers game also had Modoc in that game too. Oh yeah, well, and it's funny the game collapsed before this movie came out, because they finally had gotten it to the point where you could like fight Modoc in multiplayer, and then they basically had to cancel the game. But that game sucked. It's so bad. I finally figured out how to play it after a couple of streams where I just could not figure it out, and the payoff of like learning that combat system and getting like through the story enough that you can play on multiplayer was truly an awful experience for me. I did not care for that one bit. Tevye is saying, personally, my opinion is never a fan of Modoc in the comics, but I was fine with his depiction in the movie. Oh, that's interesting. So I could definitely see where you're coming from then. And I know people like the Modoc TV show that is on like Hulu, I guess, or Disney Plus here in Canada. And I watched some of that and also didn't care for it at all. And maybe it's because to other people, Modoc is just a comedy character, but to me, he is like a fun boss in Ultimate Alliance and stuff like that. And that's more how I prefer to think of him, as something. I guess I didn't need him to be a serious villain, but I did need him to be a serious threat. Does that make sense? He can be funny, but he's gotta like seem like a menace and not just like this, oh, I just want to be loved joke character that Cassie Lang interacts with at the end. Like, that was awful. I'm sorry. I feel like I was like, oh, it's good I read those positive things before this stream so that I won't be so negative during the review. And here I am being really negative during this review, but I did not have a good time with this. And it's almost like a cathartic moment to be getting all this out, because it's like, oh yeah, no, I had a lot of problems with this movie, more than I think I realized going into this stream. But like as I'm talking it out, I'm like, oh no, there was a lot of issues I took with this thing, and a lot of stuff I just didn't find fun. Something like, here's a good example of that, something that I really didn't just think of until now watching the posters go by. So Ant-Man and the Wasp both have powers where they're like shrinking and growing, and that's a big part of their shtick. In this movie, less than like either of the first two Ant-Man movies, or Captain America, or even some of the other Avengers-y stuff he's been in, like Ant-Man's been in, or like, and by Captain America I mean the Civil War movie, it feels like this one uses those size-changing powers the least. Maybe it's because we're in the tiny realm to begin with and we're already size-changing, but it feels like aside from them, some jokes about Cassie turning giant for the first time, and her struggling to use the like shrinky combat stuff, it really wasn't used to the same fun advantage as the other movies, and that sucks. Like it could be enjoyable to do stuff like that. Okay, so let's check out more chat. Chevy said, I had no idea this movie was affected by COVID. It was interesting. I was reading some stuff on, like, I'll just say Wikipedia, but, like, they were talking about how Loveness, when he was writing this movie, didn't really know when it was going to be filmed, how it was going to be filmed. And that, to me, makes sense of them not really knowing who necessarily was going to be in it, writing it in a certain modular way, where if they had to write certain characters out, they could, because it does feel like some characters were written out, like Judy Greer's. And yeah, I just think COVID goes a long way to explain these things. Tim is saying, question, do you trust Jeff Loveless writing Kang Dynasty? Because as much as I like this movie, I'm worried about Avengers Kang Dynasty. If he's writing that movie, I am terrified, because I did not like this one bit, and I don't trust him at all. I didn't know that. Now I gotta go check that right now. Is that true? I hope that's not true. Oh, no. Well, apparently, yeah, he is writing the script. I hope to God that movie has a good director. It doesn't seem to say here who that will be, but a good director can make up for a lackluster screenwriter, or a good co-writer can make up for a... And I don't even think Jeff Loveness is a bad writer, because I've read some of his comics and stuff, and I really like him. He wrote 2 Justice League books called Black Orchid that I thought were pretty awesome relatively recently. Like, that was right around the time of death metal. And for 2 books, I thought they were really good. They were pretty serious and thoughtful and interesting, and not just played for laughs. So hopefully Loveness does better next time, for one thing. And also, I just really... he just needs a writer who can handle more serious material and structure, because I think the dude had a lot of trouble with like structure and pacing, because this movie like suffered from that. Although that is also on Peyton Reed, who, you know, he's done all three of these Ant-Man movies now, and they feel like they just are getting worse and worse. Like the first Ant-Man movie had a lot of spark to it, probably because of the original director of that film. And then Ant-Man and the Wasp felt a lot more like a retread of the first Ant-Man movie, but I feel like they did enough differently and had enough fun with like the building that can shrink and grow and stuff that it was like watchable and worth getting through, and it had a real good kicker of an ending with that Avengers Endgame tease, and that was so good. So that stuff kind of elevated it a little bit, and then this one feels like the worst of the three by a pretty wide margin, in my opinion, and didn't have any of the charm of the first two. Where Ant-Man and the Wasp, like the second movie, suffered from some pacing issues and kind of just ended without a ton of fanfare. I didn't hate that, but Quantumania is just a mess in terms of writing. It made me someone, and I will fully admit this, like I come at everything from a writer's perspective. I am most beholden to writing in terms of evaluating stuff. You can look at any of my comic reviews, and I'm always more influenced by that than the art and such. I tend to approach things more from a writer's perspective, and I'm very verbal, if you can't tell by me talking 45 minutes straight. So, like, I am going to be pretty heavily affected by that, and I'm going to be very sensitive to that, and I just thought this movie's writing was an absolute mess. But that's just my opinion. Tevi's saying, apparently James Gunn is also directing and writing the new Superman Legacy movie, which, while I am annoyed that Henry Cavill isn't playing Superman anymore, I am hoping this new movie turns out good. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about the Superman thing with James Gunn, but I'm pretty excited about that because I think James Gunn would be a pretty interesting director for a Superman movie. It sucks that happened to Cavill. I guess we'll say I'm a little surprised and skeptical that we're apparently cleaning house with so much of the original casting of the DC movies. I don't think that's necessary for a lot of these actors. For characters, we'll say, for individuals such as Ezra Miller, and maybe others like Jesse Eisenberg, obviously for two very different reasons. Just I don't mind those being recast. But for people like Cavill, such as what Tevye mentioned, or who else would be a good example? Margot Robbie, I thought was a pretty good Harley Quinn, even if, you know, her films that didn't always live up to her as a performer. She was always great as Harley. Stuff like that I thought was always perfectly fine and could have been used in an interesting way for casting. But I digress. I kind of trust James Gunn a lot more than, you know, your average director. Or Tevye was asking earlier if I trust Jeff Loveness, and it's like, well, not after this movie. But James Gunn generally hasn't let me down before in this regard, so I'm pretty optimistic about all of that stuff. And Tevye Smokes saying Amber Heard can be recast. Yeah, no kidding. Kind of the same situation as Ezra Miller there. No love lost there, that's for sure. Yeah, then there's like another Aquaman movie coming out, I assume, at some point. I know Flash is definitely still happening, apparently. So, Tevye is also saying Marvel Now 2.0 versus DC Rebirth back in the day, good times. Yeah, that was a fun time period I was referring to with that comic series I was talking about earlier. But that was a fun time period. DC Rebirth was a very fun and exciting time, and it feels like we're in a very different place from that, even though it wasn't too long ago. But yeah, Tevye is saying, yeah. Yeah, okay. Tevia is making. I was just reading your comment there about the Avengers and the video game and how it was a train wreck, which I agree with. I mean, that's like a whole separate topic in of itself, but people have already made pretty good videos on that too. But Tevia makes an interesting point about the Avengers trying to save the Inhumans. Like did come across as pretty flat in that game, and again proves his point that the Inhumans never worked as mutant replacements, which I agree. They never could live up to that. Like the X-Men are too strong, and the Inhumans as a brand are too weak in comparison. But also Marvel attempted to just cram the Inhumans in the niche that the X-Men filled in the Marvel universe, and that never worked because the Inhumans actually are a pretty good companion piece to the X-Men. In the they exist pretty well in a larger umbrella of Marvel content where it's like, oh, if you meet a superhero, they could be an Inhuman, they could be an Eternal, they could be a mutant, they could be a mutate, they could be technologically empowered, they could be from another dimension, they could be from time travel, they could be aliens. There's all these things they could be. And that creates a big, wonderful world. And I didn't even mention magic in that list that I just came up with. But it all creates this big world where like it's anything can happen, and a threat or a new character or a new idea can come in any direction, and that's something I love most about the Marvel universe. So it's a shame that Marvel tried to do that with the Inhumans, and it's always been a big benefit to them getting a hold of all the X-Men rights again, is that Wolverine is showing up in video games again, and the X-Men can be a thing once more. So I am glad for that. But I think with chat kind of petering out a little bit, and people kind of haven't had their say and all that, I think we'll wrap things up there. I tried to make this review balanced, but I'm not even going to pretend that I succeeded. I 100% was pretty hard on this movie, but I think I needed to get some feelings out about it, and I'm kind of glad I did. Hopefully it was interesting and gave some insight into why I didn't like this movie and what I kind of thought about. Tevye also makes an interesting point that maybe puts a final bow on it, and it's the one bit of the recent MCU stuff I haven't mentioned yet, but he was saying it's kind of ironic because they are technically changing Miss Marvel in the MCU to mutant. And it's true. I thought about that when they did it. Of the sheer irony of them. Even Miss Marvel originally being an Inhuman was part of that original push towards Inhumans for sure. And now they're just going right back to X-Men and building up the X-Men again. And as soon as it's convenient for them, all of a sudden Miss Marvel's a mutant. And I think that was pretty funny. Tev is saying, I understand, Arden, even though we disagree with this movie, I respect your opinion. Oh, yeah. And, it's funny. I am a little surprised how much you enjoyed it. Not because, it's a problem. Just because we usually see eye to eye on a lot of those things. But disagreement's always good. And I'm kind of glad I was reading some interesting internet posts before, because it didn't leave me blindsided to the fact that some people like this movie, and I'm glad people did. I'm glad people are excited for the Kang stuff. I'm kind of in the middle of that. It did lead to an interesting moment when I was walking out of the theater, where Sabrina mentioned how much they hated the movie, which is fair, and they talked about how much it felt like a ripoff of Rick and Morty. And I didn't know at this time, like walking out, I know now, but I didn't know then that this movie was written by Jeff Loveness, who is a Rick and Morty writer. But I had got major Rick and Morty vibes from it. But I also pointed out, oh yeah, but like Sabrina kind of alluded to the fact that they thought the Council of Ricks...
Black me out. Words plus music.
Alexa, stop. I didn't say her name or anything. But I said to Sabrina, because they thought that this movie ripped off the Council of Ricks. I was like, no. Council of Ricks is a very direct reference to the Council of Reeds and later the Council of like Dooms and Kangs that would show up and stuff from the comic books. Like 100%. That is Marvel just being Marvel, and Rick and Morty was the one that ripped off the comics. So it was funny to correct that, but it was really interesting seeing from Sabrina's perspective of how much Quantumania is treading old ground at this point. If this movie came out like 20 years ago, it would be earth-shattering because there was nothing like this out there in terms of weirdness in the mainstream. But now with stuff like Rick and Morty and other cartoons, even like Adventure Time and Steven Universe and stuff like that, absurdist and like hard, high fantasy, like really out there concepts isn't alien to the general audience anymore. So something like Quantumania can't just rely on the novelty of it, and I think it really fell apart for me because of that. That was a major thing I was thinking of when watching the movie. And I think that kind of answers your question there, Tevya. He was asking about how I feel about the Council of Kangs. Although I'll get into that a little bit more. As an end credit scene, it was pretty fun. It actually reminded me the most of that dumb scene in like The Matrix Reloaded, where all the Neos are on the TV screen, all acting differently, and like some of them are behaving so cartoonishly and stuff in both the post-credit scene and in The Matrix, and I that's all I could think of. So it was a little goofy like that, but I did love the talking members of the Council of Kang and how different they all were. One of them even kind of reminded me of like that other iteration of Kang, Immortus. And I assume sooner or later we're going to see Iron Lad or something, because they do seem to be building towards the Young Avengers, which I think is pretty cool. I hope they do something like that. Tevye is saying Adventure Time did have some dark elements in that show, which was shocking. And I agree. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we're used to content that really pushes people's boundaries and stuff. And that is actually a similar problem that Multiverse of Madness had, is that I think people expected more. People wanted an actual Multiverse of Madness and only got like a little hint of that, really. And that movie could have gone much farther with some of its crazy multiverse content. As much as I enjoyed it, I can agree with that limitation and definitely think it was a problem. Oh, Nick Wilson also was throwing in the Avengers game is more like a nightmare than a train wreck. It really was bad. But Tevye is also hoping we get Young Avengers in the future. It definitely seems like all those stars are lining up at this point, between what's going on with Vision and like Hawkeye, along with Cassie Lang now. We have a pretty good setup for Patriot. Yeah, all the cards are definitely on that table, so that would be pretty cool. But yeah, so I think we'll call it there. But thanks so much for everyone tuning in for stream. I do hope we can kind of do some more content going forward and everything like that. But I am getting a little tired and probably need a good break. And I think an hour is a good amount of time for this review. So yeah, really appreciate everyone tuning in. And we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.